throughout the semester, hopefully, like look at Code Academy closely, because you do Java classes.
JavaScript on there.
Huh?
I think JavaScript.
Yeah, me too.
It's kind of good. Oh, cool. Java. Or just JavaScript.
Just JavaScript.
JavaScript
Still.
is HTML, CSS.
Alrighty. Anything that is more useful. You know what I mean? So that's feather in your hat.
Okay, so today is our last class meeting. We have our final exam on Thursday. So 2 days from today, minus 15 minutes, because the exam starts at 10:15 and not at 10:30. So you might want to come a little bit early, just to make sure that you have time to kind of put all your stuff out. It's open book, open notes, just like with the other two exams. The scope is expanded to include the latest material, other not counting the stuff that I said explicitly will not be in the final exam. Abstract data type is not going to be in the final exam. Object-oriented programming will not be in the final exam. But subroutines will be in the final exam. Records will be in the final exam. And also all the interaction between records and passing by reference, passing by value, those will be in the final exam as well. I have two. This one has been up for a while. Practice final exam is a zip file. The other one I just put up today. The other two, I should say, another practice final exam, and also the final exam pre and post condition sample question. These are not intended, or I did not write these only as a sample test. This is actually what students had to answer 1 year ago. So these were actual final exams 1 year ago. We'll start with this one because I think this is probably the worst of all the exams, especially for people who do not like pre and post conditions. So this one says the precondition of this line here is true, which means, what does it mean when you have a precondition being just true?
It means that that statement is true.
Oh, before that.
Or that you got there.
That we can get there, but what do we know about the variables? Nothing. Very good. All right. So we want to find out what is the post condition of line 31. In this case, we have we have two conditional statements. The inner one goes from line 24 to line 28. The outer one goes from line 23 to line 31. But the way it works out, is the same way as usual. So what we want to do is to sequentially go through this, and then we look at the branches of each conditional statement, and then figure out what are the pre and post conditions. So let me use just a plain text editor for this purpose, and I'll resize it as soon as I get the control. Right there. Okay. And we'll also go ahead and change the font size to something that's more visible. All right. So this is the pre-post condition question. All right. Where do we start? We know, and we are only given this fact here: pre-23 is true. There are two places where we can go. We can say what is pre-24, and then we can also say what is pre-30. Now, why do you think these two are related? Because they are both immediately after the branch of the outer conditional statement. Okay. What do you think pre-24 should be, just in terms of the format? Do you think it depends on pre-23? In other words, whatever is true before line 23, should that still be true before we execute line 24? That should still be true. So we should start with pre-23. What else do you think should be true by the time we are about to execute line 24? Just by the virtue of it. Sorry, go ahead. X is greater than y. The condition of the conditional statement has to be true. And that's why I also want to work on pre-30 at the same time, because they are closely related. By the time we are about to execute line 30, we also know that pre-23 still has to be true because we have not had a chance to change anything yet at this point. But at the same time, we also note that the condition of the conditional statement has to be false, because otherwise we would not be going for the else branch. We would have gone for the then branch in that case. Are we doing okay so far with these two? Okay. So once we have these two, we can get rid of the easy one first, because line 30 is really the easy one. Once we know what is pre-line 30, now we can also simplify this just a little bit, because we know pre-23 is just true, and the other way to say it is not the case that x is greater than y is x is less than or equal to y. Okay, so whenever possible, get rid of the negation, because it's just more confusing that way. Can we simplify this one more time? Yep, it just simplifies to x is less than or equal to y, because true and anything is just the anything. It's just like 1 times x is x, 1 times 5 is 5, 1 times y is y. Okay. So now that we know that the precondition of line 30 is x is less than or equal to y, what is the post-condition of line 30? In other words, what questions do we have to ask ourselves in order to find out, how do we derive the post-condition of line 30? Well, first of all, the first question usually has to do with the right-hand side, the left-hand side.
Does the right-hand side refer to the left-hand side?
Yep. Does the right-hand side refer to the left-hand side of the assignment? The answer is nope. So that means we have to use which rule?
Forget.
Yep. Use. Very good. I'm impressed that you guys still remember that. All right. So if we use the forget rule, that means the post condition is based on the precondition, but we might have to get rid of some information from the precondition. Particularly, what do we have to forget about in the precondition in this case?
Z.
Everything that we knew about z. But after the forget operation, we can also say for sure that z has to be the same as 6 at this point. All right. So now we just have to expand what is the precondition of line 30, which is just x is less than or equal to y. X is less than or equal to y does not have anything to do with z, so we get to keep the entire thing, and then we just have to say that z is also equal to 6 at this point. Are there any questions about post 30, the post condition of line 30? No question? Okay. Now we can go back to pre-24. Now pre-24 can also be simplified pretty much the same way, because we know pre-23 is true, so this becomes true and x is greater than y. And then we can simplify that one more time so that we can get just x is greater than y. Then we get to line 24. Line 24 is another conditional statement, or the beginning of another conditional statement. So we do exactly the same thing. We can break it up into line 25, and then the other one is line 27, because these two are closely related, because they're both the precondition of each branch of the inner conditional statement. What do we know about line pre-25? We are about to execute line 25. Well, we know that pre-24, sorry, go ahead. Okay, pre-24 still has to be true, because we haven't got any chance to change anything yet. And then what else?
X mod 2 equals 0.
Okay, very good. X mod 2 equals to 0. What is the usual natural way of saying x mod 2 equals to 0?
X is divisible by 2.
X is
Divisible by 2.
divisible by 2, or x is even. Okay. Now this time we cannot do a simple simplification, because pre-24 is x is greater than y, so we have to keep that one. And then the other one cannot be simplified either, because x mod 2 equals to 0 is x mod 2 equals to 0. Let's try pre-27. Pre-27 is also based on pre-24, because we have not had a chance to change anything yet. But we also know that at this point, x mod 2 equals to 0 has to be false. This time we can do just a little bit of simplification. We can just say that x mod 2 does not equal to 0 in this case. Instead of putting the negation on the outside, we change the equality to inequality. That's all we have to do. Are we doing okay so far with pre-25 and pre-27? Yes?
I have a quick question.
Yep.
If line 23 is true,
Mm-hmm.
why did you do line 30, line 29? Why did you do the else branch? That's the false branch.
The true is over there. Pre-30 is based on pre-23.
But if line 23 is true, then line 29, line 30 never would have executed.
No, okay, what this one is saying is the precondition of line 23 is true. It's not saying that the condition of line 23 is true. In other words, we are saying that we know nothing about the variables by the time we get to line 23. Now, since we don't know anything about the variables, we cannot know whether x is greater than y is true or not. You're thinking about the condition x is greater than y, whether that's true or not. But the precondition of line 23 has nothing to do with that condition.
So how do you execute everything underneath it if you don't know if it's true or not?
That's the whole thing about pre and post conditions, is you do not need to know. Basically, this is saying that we know nothing about the variables before line 23 executes. And then this is saying if we are about to execute line 24, then whatever was true before line 23 still has to be true. But we also know that x is greater than y also has to be true because we chose to execute line 24. Yep.
Shouldn't pre-25 or pre-25 be post-24? Just like that's not
No,
how we did this.
no, it's not the same.
All right.
Because with conditional statement, it is not, these two lines are not really sequential. Line 23 and line 24 are not considered sequential. In other words, line 23 does not always lead to line 24. Sometimes after line 23, we go to line 30. Other times we go to line 24. So I would not call this post 23. That's also the template that we used in class when we talked about conditional statements, when we talked about pre and post conditions. Okay. Any other questions? These are all good questions. Yep.
So then we don't need a post-23?
We do not have a post 23. That is correct. Yep.
So the only time we would use a post condition would be is if the line itself made a change.
The only time we use a post condition is the next line follows the previous line naturally. In this case, they are not, because we have a branch. So which means sometimes line 23 will be followed by line 24, but other times it will be followed by line 30. In other words, technically speaking, you can say post 23 is either here or here, because they are both after line 23 executes, but they are different. So that means I cannot just say post 23 because it has two ways to go and the condition of each branch is different. And that's why I do not refer to either one as post 23. So I only say that one is called pre 24 and the other one is pre 30. Is that okay? All right. So getting back to here. All right, so let's go ahead and finish post 25. Post 25 is actually pretty easy because we just asked the same question. This time we can just state the answer. The right-hand side does not refer to the left-hand side, so use the forget rule. Okay. So once we know we have to use the forget rule, then we just apply that. We look at pre-25. We forget everything that we know about z, because z is the variable being changed here. And then after that, we can say z equals 4 in this case. And then it's just kind of tedious, but you do have to plug in what is pre-25 just to make sure that we don't have a component mentioning z. And then the forget operation actually doesn't do anything because z is not mentioned anywhere within the precondition. So we just keep the entire thing. X is greater than y. X mod 2 equals to 0. And this time we also know z equals 4. Are we doing okay? And then pre-27 is pretty much the same thing. We can just say the right-hand side does not refer to the left-hand side. Use the forget rule. And then we can say post-27 is based on pre-27, but we have to forget everything that we knew about z. And then after this, we also know that z equals 5. So for the most part, this is the same thing as the previous one. Pre-27 is x is greater than y, and x mod 2 does not equal to 0. And also z equals 5 is after the forget operation, so don't forget it. There's nothing to forget. We get to keep the entire condition because nothing mentioned z. And then after that, we also know that z equals 5. Are we doing okay so far? We now know what is the post condition of line 25, and we also know what is the post condition of line 27. Yep.
I think the pre-27 is not as mod 2 different, right?
You mean here?
Yeah, the pre-27. Yeah, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, I took the negation and changed the equality to a not equal to.
Oh, yeah.
So they mean the same thing.
Okay.
Very good. All right, so now can we come to a conclusion? What is post 28? Post 28, exactly. So the format is, it is just pre-25, post 25 or post 27.
You have to simplify that after.
There's
I mean, do you
not
have to
much
put
you
everything?
can. There's not much you can do to simplify. You
I
can
mean, do you have
simplify.
to put post 25, the actual post 25 there? Or post, do you have to put whatever post 25 is and whatever post 27 is? Or you just put post 25 or post 27?
You mean in the test?
Yeah.
In the test, you have to kind of copy and paste the whole thing. You can we can simplify a little bit. I'll show you guys what we can simplify here. So in this case, post 25, it is a lot easier with a editor. Okay, so just copy and paste it here. Maybe I'll just consider letting you guys just state post.
Post 27.
Post here.
Yeah, 'cause that gets to be a lot of writing, especially on a test when we can't cheat like you and cut and paste.
Cheater.
Multiple choice?
Multiple choice.
That would be awesome, but you'd have to throw them all. They'd all have to be trick questions.
I think this is better because you can get partial credit. With multiple choice, you don't have partial credit.
Sure.
So
But you can explain why you choose that answer and you get partial
no,
credit.
no. With multiple choice, you cannot explain it. I mean, if you
You
get
can
it wrong,
try.
you get it wrong.
We could just do a take-home final.
Take home final. Yeah.
Short answer.
Well, when I was in college and also in graduate school, when the professor said at the end of the semester we have a take-home final,
No, I don't.
we all dreaded it.
Yeah.
Because that usually means it doesn't matter if the entire class sit down and work on it together. It would not have made any difference.
A lot of work.
Yeah. I hate those take-home final that you have an entire weekend to work on. That just ruins your weekend. If it's one night, one day, it's bad, but if it's over the weekend, it usually means, it doesn't matter how many days you spend on it or whether you guys spend time on it together, it would not have made any difference.
But there's no pressure.
Sorry?
It's like the number one thing about take-home finals are awesome is that there's no real pressure on you.
Yeah, there is.
There's not as many limits as single final in a classroom. How about that? How about that?
True, but
Exactly, in my case.
Okay, in this case, I can simplify it. You don't have to do this step, definitely. But I can simplify a little bit just by taking the common factor out of the whole thing. But you definitely don't have to do anything like this in the exam.
So we just need like bow 27 or bow 20.
I would say that I want to see this part, just so that you know where to copy from, so that would be useful. But we are not quite done yet. So this one is particularly nasty, because now we have figured out what is post 28. We also have figured out what is post 30. So it's time to figure out what is post 31. But you already know the structure. So post 31, in terms of structure, is really just post 28 or post 30. Okay. But just because it's easy to say it like this, doesn't mean it's going to be easy for you to deal with it, because you have to copy and paste the entire thing. So.
Sweet.
Ah, go away. There we go. So here's one, and then here's the other one.
Post 30 is easy.
I'll make sure that in your test you don't have to deal with like lots of text like this. This one was intended for a class where we took the test online, at the lab. So copy and paste was easy, but in your case, because it's all on paper, make sure that it's not as involved in terms of writing. Yep, go ahead.
Could you do an example of one where the right-hand side does refer to the left-hand side real quick?
Sure.
Substitution.
Yep, you have to use the substitution rule. All right, let's save this file first before I forget. This is practice. All right. So what we'll do is we can just change one of the assignment statements to one that has the right hand side refers to the left hand side. So let's say we change this program. Okay, so this is the new code. Oh boy, it doesn't look good.
That was cute.
You're gonna do.
No, it has to do with copy and pasting a table. Doesn't work. How about one where there's no indentation?
If you can figure this out, you deserve the extra credit.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll just change this one to, let's say, x gets x plus 1. Okay. In fact, we can just change the arrow to a real arrow here. Although I don't know how it's going to show when you open this up in Notepad, because it depends on the font and whether the encoding can encode the left arrow. All right, so with this one, it's almost the same, except when we try to figure out what is post 30, it will be different. So for the most part, I can just copy and paste a whole bunch of what we had already. This part here can just be copied and pasted here. What we cannot copy and paste is what is pre-30 can be copied and pasted, but post cannot. So we can still copy this part here. But when we try to figure out what is post, we cannot. Because when you look at line 30, the right-hand side, which is x plus 1, does refer to the variable on the left-hand side, which is x. So this time, when we work on this one, we have to say the right-hand side refers to the left-hand side. Now, just because the right-hand side refers to the left-hand side is not enough, because you also have to make sure that whatever the function is reversible. So you have to say, f of x is x plus 1 has an inverse, which is f prime of x, which is x minus 1. Now that means we can use the substitution rule. When you use the substitution rule, then you say post 30 is based on the substitution of the precondition of line 30. What are we substituting with what? We're substituting all
Instances of x with f prime of x.
f prime of x. That's right. So that line, this line here is worth points because it tells me that you know the structure and how to apply the substitution rule. The next line is really just expanding what we know about pre-30, which is just x is less than or equal to y. And then we also have to replace x prime of x, replace that by with x minus 1. And then we carry out the actual substitution operation. So that means x is now replaced by x minus 1. So x minus 1 is less than or equal to y is the post condition. Okay. So by the time we get to the grand finale, it'll be about the same. Except we change the very last part here, and we'll say x minus 1 is less than or equal to y. That's it. Okay. Are there any questions about this? Yep, go ahead.
Will you upload this file into the...
If you remind me, I will.
I'll look at you after class 2.
Okay, send me an email now.
Now that doesn't always work. I've done that before.
Too early, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about this one? Yep.
I'm going to say before, but is there only going to be one pre and post condition question on the final?
Yes, only one pre and post. Unless you guys want more. No?
backwards one.
Any other questions about this one? Nope, that's it. Okay, make sure we save the file again. Well, I guess all the left arrows would not appear correctly now. Okay, just remember, these symbols are all left arrows. By the time you open the file, it may look kind of strange. So just keep that in mind.
How can we open this file from?
It's just a text file.
No. How can you download it from the website?
I will tar up all the files, or I should say, I will zip up all the files.
It's alright, you can tar. I can tar.
Tar is not a common thing that people understand, so I will zip the files up. So by the time we upload the file, there'll be a link at the end of the Moodle site. You just download that one file, and then you unzip it.
Okay.
Windows can natively unzip files. If you have Windows XP or later, it knows how to unzip files. Then all the files that we work on today will be there. All right. So any other questions about this? I think it's not letting me save the file until I change all these to something else. So I'll go ahead and search and replace. Find that, replace with that. Replace all 3 strings. Okay, that sounds good. Save again. It's all good now. All right. Now we can move on and talk about the other questions. And these are all zipped. This is also zipped up, which means you can also just open these in Windows. But you do need to have an Open Office installed. The file names do not indicate what the question is, because I don't want to give anyone any clue of what the program actually does. So I just use model numbers of cars to instead of the actual file names.
It's the AE86.
Huh?
What's the AE86?
The AE86 is the most famous drifting car in Japan.
Oh,
Japan?
In Japan, yes.
That's funny. I recognize the MR2 and the RX-7, but I don't know the SI-300.
IS. That's a Lexus
I have dyslexia,
IS.
sorry.
Yeah, the RX-7 is actually not a very accurate description because it depends on the chassis too. So FC, FD.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is the question, this is the actual question from last spring, 1 year ago. And then we'll go ahead, we'll save the file first into today's folder, so that way we won't forget it. So when I upload everything, it will also include the answers to these exam questions. All right, we'll go ahead and take a quick look at this program, and then we'll try to figure out what it's going to do. First of all, from line 2 to line 5, oops, oh, I forgot. This is end record. There we go. So from line 2 to line 5 is the definition of a record type. It has two members. The first one is I, the second one is J. They're both integers. From line 6 to line 14 is a subroutine. It passes I by reference, passes J by reference, it has a local variable X, and it does a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. We'll figure out what the mumbo jumbo is later on. And then we have line 15 to line 20, which is a stub subroutine because I don't want to use any global variables. And then line 21 is the entry point to the entire program, just so that I do not need to use any global variables. All right. Yep, go ahead.
Is there a reason there's no line 1?
Yeah, because line 1 is just, because last year I want people to write down their student ID at the beginning of each spreadsheet. So, that took up line 1. It doesn't really matter as long as the line numbers are not duplicate. They can even skip by 10 or 20. Yes, that will still be okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and trace this program. All right, when you trace this program, this one doesn't have any print statement, doesn't have any conditional statement. So we don't really need comments. We just need line number to begin with. The precondition is there's nothing to say because we don't have any global variables. So on line 21, we can start the execution on line 21. On line 21, we are invoking stub. Now, we have to set up a few things with stub. The first thing is the return line number so that we know where to go back to after stub is done. In this case, we go back to post because that's the last line. Line 21 is the last line of the entire program already. Then we also have to set up the local variables as well as the parameters. In this case, stub has no parameters, but it does have one local variable, which is x. X is not an integer. X is of the type R. The type R here is a record type. It has two members. Each one is an integer. So that means I, as a member, will take up one column, and J, as a member, will take up another column. So technically speaking, X takes up two columns. And it's the same thing. I have to turn off track changes. Then I can merge the columns. Okay. So are there any questions about why X is taking up column C and column D? No questions?
Yeah, why isn't it defined as a record as a R?
Say again?
Why is it I and J instead of just itself?
I and J. Well, X has two components.
But you're not saying that it is a record R.
It is a record R when you look at line 16.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's what I missed.
Okay. So you have to pay attention to the type now of your local variables as well as your parameters.
Right. My problem is I was looking at 9 and not 16.
Oh, okay, I see. All right. So now we can put a question mark here and a question mark here because X is still a local variable, which means the content is undefined when you allocated the columns. Then we can go into the subroutine, starting execution on line 17. Line 17 wants to put a value of 2 into the member called I in X. Member I of X is column C, so that gets initialized to a value of 2. Likewise, on line 18, J gets a value of 5. Are we doing okay so far with this program? Then we move on to line 19. Now line 19 is a little bit tricky. The first part is pretty easy. The return line number part is easy because the invocation is on line 19. When you look at subroutine Q, it does not return a value. Okay, I have another typo here. Change that to B. And so the return line number is just line 20 because the invocation is on line 19. So we just have to go to the next line. The question now is, how do we set up the parameters? We have parameter I, parameter j, and local variable x. This local variable x is just an integer. It takes up one column. It starts with an unknown value, and that's all that we have to deal with. What about I? AKA column C. Very good. That's because I use x.I, which is this x refers to column C and column D. Dot I means I'm specifically talking about column C. I'm using column C to specify passing the pass by reference parameter I. So parameter I is also known as column C. It is a reference to column C. And for the same reason, J is AKA column D. In other words, everything that we learned about passing by reference with simple variables really has not changed. Except this time, I can identify a particular column that is inside the structure. But the actual mechanism of passing by reference really has not changed. When we get into the subroutine, we have a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo starting on line 10. Line 10 says I want to compute the sum of I and j. Okay. So in this case, this is referring to parameter I and parameter j. Parameter I is also known as column C, which now has a value of 2. Parameter j is also known as column D, which has a value of 5. 2 plus 5 is 7, and so I have to store 7 in parameter I. But parameter I cannot store any value. It is only a reference to some other column. So when I need to store, I have to store that in column C. So column C is now updated to a value of 7. Line 11 wants to store the value of j in x. J is also known as column D. Column D still has a value of 5, so x now has a value of 5. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Right there. Okay. And now we move on to line 12. Line 12 wants to compute the difference between I and x. I refers to column C. Column C has a value of 7. 7 minus x, which is 5, is 2. We want to store 2 to parameter j. Parameter j is also known as column D, so column D is the one that has to be updated to a value of 2. And we move on to line 13. Line 13 says we want to compute the difference between I and j, parameter I and parameter j. Parameter I is column C. It has a value of 7 at this point. Parameter j is column D, which now has a value of 2. So make sure you use the latest value in a column. Because I think in the previous exam, some people refer to an earlier value, by accident, by mistake. So you have to refer to the latest value. 7 minus 2 is 5. We want to store 5 to I. Once again, I refers to column C. So column C is the one that will get a new value of 5. Haven't we seen something like this before, just in a slightly different way? Swapping. Yep, I'm doing swapping, but using just additions and subtractions. Now we get to line 14. Line 14 says it's the end of the subroutine. So that means it's time to look up the return line number, remind ourselves that we have to continue execution on line 20, and then we have to indicate that these columns are no longer in use. And on line 20, it's the same thing. It is the end of another invocation. So now this time we have to remind ourselves that we have to continue execution at post. And then we say that these columns are no longer in use. And that's the end of the trace. Any questions about this one? It's almost the same stuff as what we have talked about in this class, except I just threw passing by reference and mix it up with records. Any questions about this one? Nope. Okay. So I'll save it, and then we can move on to the next question. The next question is, this one here. And this is something that we have done already. It's something that we have done in the previous exam, so I don't think it should be surprising to anyone in this class. We have the stub subroutine, and inside the stub subroutine we have a local variable I. It is initialized to a certain value. We invoke another subroutine and pass I by reference, so that the value of I would actually get modified for each invocation. And then we have to keep track of the print statement as well as the return value of each invocation. So there's nothing new in this one. We should have been able to answer this question even in exam 2. So we'll go ahead and take a look and see if we still remember how to do something like this. Make sure that we save the file first. Go. All right. So this time we do need, comments on one side, but we don't need to use it until much later. So I'm going to hide it for the time being. We start with line number. We do not have any global variables, so pre has nothing to say. And then we start with line 13. Line 13 is invoking the stub subroutine. So naturally, we need a return line number to tell us where to go back to. This time we have to go back to post because stub does not return a value, so there's nothing to really do at that point. Even though it has no return value and no parameter, it does have a local variable I, and all local variables must start with an unknown value. And once we have all the columns set up, we can continue execution in the stub subroutine, starting on line 10. Line 10 is easy. Local variable I gets a value of 2. Then we move on to the kind of confusing line, which is line 11. Line 11 is eventually a print statement. In other words, we're going to print the value of something to the screen. But we can't really do any printing at this point because we need to find out what those two invocations of P are going to return first. Okay. So what are we going to do? We need to set up a return info because we are invoking P, and in cases like this, we just read it from left to right, so we'll handle the one on the left first. All right, so this time we have return info instead of return line number. When we specify return info, we have to indicate the line number and the rest of the line other than the invocation, but everything else has to be here. So we have invoke P. I think we use I to specify X again. And I think the second time, did we use 2 to specify Y? I don't know. Oh, I guess we'll find out. Nope, 3. Okay. In the previous exam, because we're doing this on paper, most people ran out of space. So if you just say invoke P and then ... I'll just accept that. As long as, when you invoke it the second time, the correct parameters are actually passed. Okay. Okay, what else do we have to specify here? This is an invocation, so that means we have to allocate columns for all the parameters. Parameter X, parameter Y need their own columns. Parameter X and parameter Y. What are we passing to X? We are using I, local variable I, which is living in column D at this point, to specify parameter X. So X being passed by reference is also known as column D in this case. Y is passed by value, which means it doesn't really, it's not a reference to another column, it has its own value. In this case, that value is 5. Are we doing okay so far with how the columns are set up? Okay. So now that the columns are all set up, we can go into subroutine P starting on line 5. Oops. Undo. Okay, so on line 5, we are executing. On line 5, we are adding x and y. X is a reference to column D. Column D has a value of 2. 2 plus y, which is 5, is 7. We are storing 7 back into x. X is also known as column D. So I, or column D, is updated to 7 in this case. Are we doing okay so far with this? Passing by reference. And then on line 6, we have a return statement. What do we do when we have a return statement? We locate the return info cell, copy and paste it, and change just the question mark to the value that we are returning. What are we returning in this case?
7.
We're returning 7. Very good. And we don't change anything else on the return in the return info cell. Then we go to line 7. Line 7 is the end of this subroutine, which means we have 2 things to do. One is to remind ourselves that we have to go back to line 11, and the second thing is to deallocate all the columns. Now, in the previous exam, in exam number 2, quite a few people did not write down the line numbers correctly. You know, they were skipping either skipping line numbers or the line numbers are incorrect, especially after the return, after the end define sub. So it's very, very important to keep track of the line numbers correctly when you're tracing a program. Now we're back to line 11. Can we print at this point? No, because we still have one more side of the addition that is still an invoke, and we don't know what value it is, it's going to return. So this means we have to invoke it again, and in the trace you have to reallocate column E. Okay. In the previous test, some people did not do that. They just kept using the return info. But technically speaking, column E was deallocated on row 10 of the trace, and it is reallocated on row 11. Because these columns are allocated and deallocated on the fly. Every time you invoke, it is allocated. Every time you get to the end of a subroutine, they are deallocated. So we have to reallocate the same 3 columns because we are calling the same subroutine. So we have x and we have y again. But this time the return info cell is a lot simpler because we already know the 7 is here. And then the second invocation is going to be replaced by a single question mark. X is still the same thing. We are still using local variable I to specify parameter x. So it is still a reference to column D. And as far as y is concerned, it is 3 because we use 3 to pass to parameter y. Then everything else is just the same thing when we get into the subroutine. On line 5, we add x and y together. X is also known as column D. Column D now has a value of 7. So remember to use 7, the updated value, and not the old value of 2. 7 plus 3 is 10. We store that 10 back into x, which is also known as column D. So column D is now updated to a value of 10. In the final exam, do not refer to the name of the variable. In this case, it is I. Refer to the column number instead. Okay, it is very important that we use the column number and not the name of the variable. After line 5, we get to line 6, which is just returning the current value of x. X is also known as column D. It has a value of 10 at this point. So when we return that value, we have to copy and paste the return info cell, change the question mark in this case to 10, and then we move on to line 7. Line 7 is the end of the subroutine, so once again we have to go back to line 11 because our return info cell tells us so. The second thing we have to do is once again to deallocate these 3 columns. So these 3 columns are now deallocated. We now continue execution on line 11. Line 11 looks like this now. We do not need to invoke anymore because we know 7 plus 10 is 17. So that means we know that the program is just going to print a value of 17 to the screen, and that concludes the execution of line 11. After line 11, we go to line 12. Line 12 is the end of a subroutine. 2 things to do. One is to look up the return line number so that we know to continue execution at post, and then we can deallocate column C and column D in this case. All right. Any questions about this one? No questions? All right. So moving right along to the next one. They don't make MR2s anymore. In fact, they don't make any of these cars anymore.
Too bad.
What a shame. All right. Well, before we trace the program, let's go ahead and take a look at the program first. The first line to execute is line 13. It's just a print statement. It calls, it invokes the subroutine P. Subroutine P is over here, has two parameters. It has parameter x, parameter y. If x is less than y, then we invoke the subroutine again. And if x is greater than y, we invoke the subroutine again. It's only the case when x equals to y that we do not invoke or we do not do it recursively. When we do the recursion, you have to be careful because of these two lines are slightly different. The first one will keep x the way it is and only decrease y. The second one will decrease x and keep y the same. Okay. This one is a little bit trickier than the one that we have before because we have invoke on the same line as the return. It should not change a single thing. The way we return a value really should not change. It just looks more confusing this way, but it really should not be more confusing than the previous one. So let's go ahead and save the file first into today's folder. And now we can trace it. Definitely need comments because we have print and also conditional statements. And then we have line numbers. The precondition is there's nothing to say because I still do not have any global variables. On line 13, we have to invoke P. And, well, there are several things we have to kind of pay attention to. Is first, this invocation requires a return. Do we need a return line number or do we need a return info in this case? Return info because we have to get back to line 13 in this case. So we need return info to return back to line 13 because there will be one last thing to do on line 13 by the time we get back here. The invocation itself is going to require two parameters, parameter x as well as parameter y. They're both passed by value. The first invocation on line 13 is pretty easy because we just say, okay, we will use 2 to specify x and we'll use 4 to specify y. And once the columns are all set up, we can go into the subroutine starting on line 5. Line 5 evaluates the condition, x is less than y is true. Okay, so we move on to line 6 in this case. Line 6 is a return statement, but I cannot execute the return statement just yet because the value that we are returning depends on the invocation of P. So that means we have to invoke P again on line 6. Until it returns, there's nothing I can do on this line with this invocation. So we have to do the same thing here, return info, but this time it is on line 6, and we are returning whatever the invocation is returning. So that part gets replaced with a question mark. We also have to specify parameter x as well as parameter y. X is just passed to x, y minus y is passed to y. The first one refers to this x here. It has a value of 2. The second part, which is y, refers to local, oops, sorry. Okay.
So on the trace column at row 7, shouldn't it be return question mark times y?
Oh, I forgot about the times y. You're correct.
I actually want to ask you a question about that. At that point, do you use y after the invocation?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So right there's just question mark times y, and then once everything's done, the return statement, the updated value of y. Or I guess the value of y is not going to change in that instance because all that value.
Correct. In this case, it doesn't matter because we're only passing y by value. So the value of y is not going to be changed. in the case that y can potentially be changed, I think the behavior depends on the implementation of the compiler. So in those cases, it gets a little bit tricky because it depends on how the compiler wants to do the multiplication. It can grab the value of y first before calling the subroutine, and if the subroutine changes the value of y, then we do not know which value of y is going to use for the multiplication.
But in this instance, we're using the y from column E, one way or the other, whether it's by reference or by value.
That is correct, yes. Because this line 6 is still from the perspective of column C to column E. Okay. So y is going to have a value of 3 because it is 4 minus 1. And then we can go into the subroutine again, starting on line 5. And it's going to be the same thing. X is less than y is true because x is 2, y is 3. So we go to line 6 one more time. When we are at line 6, we have to do the same thing. Let me see if I can change the split of the columns so we can do it a little bit easier this way. Yep. Okay. So we're back on line 6, and in order to do this subroutine call, we have to specify the return info as line 6, return whatever the invocation is returning times y. And then we have 2 more columns, one for parameter x, which is 2, and one for parameter y, which is also 2 in this case, because it is 3 minus 1, and that's why it's 2. And then after that, we go back into the subroutine, starting from the beginning, which is on line 5. X is less than y, this time is false. Then we have to go to the second branch of the conditional statement, which is on line 7. Line 7 says, is x greater than y? Nope, that is not the case. So we have to skip line 8, and we have to go to the else case, which is on line 10. Line 10 says we just want to return the value of x. X has a value of 2, so that means we locate the return info cell, copy and paste it, change the question mark to a value of 2, and then we are done. After line 10, we get out of the conditional statement, then we end up on line 12. On line 12, we have to look up the return info cell so that we know that we have to continue execution on line 6. After that, we deallocate the columns of this invocation, and we are done with that invocation. Are we doing okay so far? So now that we are back to line 6, which line 6 are we talking about? Well, we are talking about line 6 being like this. In other words, now is the time to figure out what is the current value of y, which is 3, multiply that to 2, and then execute the return 6 statement at this point. Are we doing okay so far? This is what we are executing. This is what we are changing into this. And since we're returning a value of 6, the question mark gets changed to a 6. Are we doing okay so far with this part? We have seen this quite a few times, but I think every single time, it doesn't hurt to kind of remind ourselves, what needs to happen.
So shouldn't we get rid of the times y on row 15 if we already updated value 6?
You mean this y here?
Yeah.
No, this is preparing for the next time when we get back.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, just remember, every time we execute a return statement, we only change the question mark to the value that we are returning. We don't touch anything else in that cell, okay? So once again, we are executing this statement. We are changing, as a result of executing this statement, which is returning 2 times y, and y is 3 in this case. So as a result of returning 6, I am changing the return info cell of column F to this. Okay, so that's the really confusing part, is we have quite a few cells that look about the same thing, so you have to identify which one tells us what to do and what is the effect of doing that. So now that we are done with line 6, we move on, because line 6 is the only thing we have to do in this branch. So after line 6, we get all the way out of the conditional statement. So the next line to execute is line 12. Line 12 has 2 jobs to do. One is to tell us we have to continue execution on line 6 again. And the second thing is to deallocate the columns that we have allocated for this invocation. We are now back to line 6 again. But this time, line 6 looks like this. This is what we are executing in order to change this to this. Okay, well, since we're executing return 6 times y, which y are we talking about? We're talking about column E because column H is already gone. It is deallocated. So the only column E, the only column that has a label of y is column E, which has a value of 4. 6 times 4 is 24. So that means we are returning a value of 24 in this case. So that means we have to copy and paste the return info cell, change the question mark to 24, and that's the end of line 6 in this case. So once again, we are executing this statement in order to change this cell to this cell. Are we doing okay so far? After line 6, we get out of the entire conditional statement. We get to line 12. So once again, line 12 has 2 things to do. One is to figure out what is the next line to execute, which is line 13. The second thing is to deallocate the columns for this particular invocation. And now we are on to line 13. But line 13 is now looking like this. And we don't have any more invocations to do. We can actually print the value to the screen. So we just say we're printing a value of 24 to the screen. After that, we move on to post. Oops. Because there's nothing else to do in this trace. Yep.
So in this one, on line 7, if we
on line 7 or row 7?
on line 7,
Line 7.
if we change the last statement, like if x less than or equal to y, how the program gonna go?
If we change this to x is less than or equal to y, I believe the program is going to be infinite.
Infinite.
Yeah, because because no matter how x and y relate to each other, it will still be calling p again.
Yeah.
So there's no end to it in that case. Good question. Okay. Anything else about this program? Nothing? Okay. So once again, this program really doesn't have anything that is new to this class since exam 2, because we had exam 2 pretty late. So that means this question should be actually, it's in the scope of exam 2 of this class. All right, we only have one more question to go. And here we have it. This one looks a little bit nasty because it has several things going on here. Okay, first of all, we have an invoke statement here, and this one does have a global variable because b has to be a global variable in this case. Then we get into subroutine P. So in subroutine P, we're going through the entire array. But when you look at array A, it is passed by reference. It is an array of n. And record n looks like this. It has 2 members, member x and member y. And we have to do some mumbo jumbo, in the subroutine. And when you look at sheet 2 in this case, it is already pre-initialized. The global variable b is already pre-initialized. So what we'll do is we'll trace this program using sheet 2. And for a question like this, I will also have these columns pre-initialized in your test question, so you don't have to do this part. I'll probably do it in a way that doesn't take up any space because we're already running out of space pretty quickly using a column format like this. So, well, I cannot really save any space because these values will change as the program executes. So there's no way to save columns in this case. All right, so let's go ahead and start tracing this program. The entire precondition is given to you, so we can now start with line 15. Line 15 is invoking P, and we are using global variable B in this case to specify parameter A. Okay. So that means we have to set up a return line number because subroutine P does not return a value, so return line number would be fine in this case. We are returning to post, and then we have to use 1 column per parameter and per local variable in this case. We have parameter A, it is passed by reference. we have local variable I, which is just an integer. That's why it is unknown to begin with. The question is, what do we put here?
column C to H.
Column C to column H. Because B, as a global variable, B is actually taking up column C to column H. B bracket 0, which is one element in that array, is a record n, and that's why it takes up 2 columns. Within those 2 columns, member X takes up column C, and then member Y takes up column D. So that's how the whole thing is broken down. Are we still doing okay so far with this? Okay. Then we move on to, I'm trying to see if I can display the whole thing. I don't think we need that much space for columns, so I'm going to shrink this a little bit so we can see everything. We still cannot see column I. Oh, there we go. Local variable I. All right, so we start with line 9. Line 9 is just the initialization of my local variable I. It gets initialized to a value of 1. And we move on to line 10. Line 10 is the first line of a while loop. We have to evaluate the condition. I at this point is 1, is less than bar A bar. What is bar A bar in this case? In other words, what is the number of elements in array A?
3.
There are, nope, 3. Okay, because A refers to column C to column H. When you look at column C to column H, there are only 3 elements because each element is a record n. It takes up 2 columns. Okay, so that's important. We are not counting columns. We are counting the number of elements. Okay, so in this case, X is 1 and bar A bar is 3. 1 is less than 3 is true. We go into the loop on line 11. Okay, what is line 11 doing? This looks awfully confusing. Well, let's go ahead and do it step by step. Okay, the most important part is to do it step by step. What is A? A is also known as column C to column X, so we know we are looking at this portion of the trace. What is I? I has a value of 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. So we practically have bracket 0 here. So we are now looking at just column C and column D. But we don't want the entire thing. We only want the member Y. Member Y is just column D itself. In other words, the left-hand side of the addition is just referring to 11. Are we doing okay so far? So we have 11 on one side. The other side is A bracket I dot X. Once again, A is also known as column C to column H. This is column C to column H. This time we only have I inside the square brackets. I has a value of 1, so we are referring to the second element of the array. I don't need the entire element. I just need member X of that element. Member X is just referring to column E, which has a value of 5. So we have 11 plus 5, which is 16. Where do we want to store the 16? To A bracket I dot Y. So if I want to be naggy and just talk through the whole thing, then we are looking at A, but A refers to column C to column H. I is 1, so the square bracket is just referring to the second element. We don't need the entire thing because we just need member Y. In this case, member Y is column F. So column F is the one that will be updated to a value of 16. Are we still doing okay so far? So it's just step by step. Just resolve it step by step, and then you get to the single column and get the value. After line 11, we go to line 12. Line 12 is just adding 1 to I. I goes from 1 to 2. We go back to line 10 again. I is now 2, bar A bar is 3, 1 I is less than bar A bar is true one more time. We go to line 11 again. Well, since we did it the first time, the second time should be pretty quick. So we're back to line 11 again. We now evaluate A bracket I minus 1 dot Y. This is A, it refers to column C to column H. I has a value of 2 at this point. 2 minus 1 is 1. So we are now referring to just column E, and column F. Within those two columns, I just need the column corresponding to member Y. Member Y is column F, so we know the first value is 16. Remember, not 12, because we changed it already to 16. What about the other side of the addition? We have A bracket I dot X. Okay, this is A. It refers to these columns. We have I inside the square bracket. I has a value of 2, so we are now referring to column G to column H. Within those two columns, we just need the one corresponding to member X. Member X is column G, which has a value of 6. So we are adding 16 to 6, which is 22. We are storing that to A bracket I dot Y. A, once again, refer to the entire thing. I is 2, so we are referring to column G to column H. And this time we only need member Y, which is column H. So column H is the one that is now updated to a value of 22. And that finishes line 11. Line 12 is adding 1 to I again. I goes from 2 to 3. Then we go back to line 10. I is 3. 3 is less than RE bar, which is also 3, is false. So now we get out of the loop. Once we get out of the loop, we end up on line 14. Line 14 is the end of the entire subroutine. It has two things to do. One is to look up the return line number. We have to continue execution at post. And then the second thing is it has to deallocate all the columns that we have allocated earlier. And then we just have to indicate these are now deallocated. And we're done. Any questions about this particular program? Not too long, it only has 16 lines in the trace, of which I have provided up to row 4 already. So you only have 12 rows to trace in this case. But it does exercise the concept that we have talked about, which is an array, because it has elements, but each element is a record. It also has passing by reference, the basic concept of loops, the usual stuff. So are we doing okay so far? We still have a little bit of time left, and so we'll go ahead and take a look at another practice exam. All right, so we'll save this.
So will the other two questions be somewhat like these then, I guess?
The other one, because remember, we only have 6 questions in all, and this is we already talked about 5 questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we talked about 5 questions already, so there will just be one additional question of this type.
Okay.
All right, I think we might have enough time for just one more practice question. Question? Okay. And this time we have, let's try this one. This is the only car that I know of that is still in production. All right, so this one is the same thing. It has arrays, but it doesn't have. This one is kind of long, so I'll just talk about it because it's going to be long. We have an array B. It has 3 elements. In this case, to answer this question, you have to use specific digits from your student ID to fill in X, Y, and Z. So I'll just fill it in with 561. And the subroutine, okay, we'll go ahead and trace it. I think we have enough time to do it. Okay, so here we have the trace. I'll turn off changes. Oh, it's already off. All right, so we'll go ahead and start on line 10. Line 10 is printing the result of this invocation. So that means we have to use return info because it's returning a value. Then we have to say line 10, print whatever the invocation returns because there's nothing else on that line. Then we have to specify the parameters. We have parameter A and also parameter I. Parameter A is passed by reference, and I'm using D to specify that parameter. So that means A as a parameter is also known as column C to column E. I is passed by value, which is bar B bar minus 1. B has 3 elements. Bar B bar is 3, 3 minus 1 is 2. So column H starts with a value of 2. And then we go into the subroutine, which is starting on line 4. On line 4, we're just asking, is I different from 0? The answer is no. So we have to go to line 7. And line 7 is just returning A bracket I.
I did not equal 0. Isn't that true?
Oh, that's true. Sorry. Yep. It is true, so we have to go to line 5. Otherwise, there's no recursion. So we go to line 5. Line 5 is returning A bracket I plus 3 times the following. So we'll go ahead and set up return info in this case. It is on line 5. We still have the return that is not done yet. A bracket I is not done yet. 3 is not done, is to be evaluated. And then we replace the invocation with a question mark. And then we have to set up the other 2 parameters. Parameter A is set up the same way. So in this case, we are passing something that was passed by reference to me to someone else also by reference. So that means we just keep the reference. We do not say this one is also known as column G, which was one of the mistakes that many people made in the previous exam. Then we have parameter I, and if I remember, I is just I minus 1. So I was 2, so this time it is 1. Like so. And then we get back into the subroutine. Still have about 3 minutes. We'll have enough time. Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of make sure that I can display enough to do the trace. Okay, starting on line 4, same thing. I has a value of 1. 1 is different from 0 is true. Go to line 5. We set up the same thing again. So this is kind of copy and paste again. Except I this time is going to have a value of 0. So the recursion stops here. Go back to line 4. I is different from 0. It's finally false because I is 0. So we do not go to line 5. Instead, we go to line 7 in this case. So here's line 7. Line 7 just wants to return A bracket I. A is also known as column C to column E. Within column C to column E, bracket 0 is column C, which has a value of 5. So we have to change the question mark from a question mark to 5 in this case. And we are done with the return statement. Then we get out of the conditional statement, go to line 9. 2 things to do. 1, to remind ourselves that we have to continue execution on line 5. Second thing is to deallocate these columns. Now we are back to line 5. But line 5 now looks like this. In other words, now we have to figure out what are we adding to 3 times 5. We are adding A bracket I. But this time, A bracket I refers to A bracket 1, which has a value of 6. 6 plus 15 is 21. So that means we are returning a value of 21. The question mark is now replaced with 5 in this case. Oops, 21, because we are returning a value of 21. Don't simplify. Do not simplify. 3 times 21 is 63. This is not the time to evaluate the multiplication. And then we get out to line 9. Same thing. We have to do 2 things. 1, to remind ourselves that we have to go back to line 9. And then the second thing is to remove or deallocate these columns. And we have about 1 minute left, just in time. Now we're back to line 5 again, but line 5 now looks like this. The question is, what are we adding to 63? This time I is 2, so we are adding 1 to 63, which is 64. So we are returning 64, which means we take the return info cell, change the question mark to 64, and then we're done with the return statement. After line 5, we get to line 9 again. Two things to do: remind ourselves that we have to continue on to line 10, and then we deallocate these columns. Now we're back to line 10, but line 10 looks like this. So we are just going to print the value of 64. There's nothing else to do. We get to post, and we are done with 13 seconds to spare.
Can you upload those to Moodle right now?
Yes.
Right now.
I will do it right now. Yes.
Right
No.
now.
10:15.